welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is a risk management firm specialising in financial crime. Our aim of these podcasts is to bring you interesting news, interviews and recordings of our exclusive events from the world of financial crime. What is terrorist financing? With Professor Nicholas Ryder. In a series of summer podcasts and briefing papers that Themis will be hosting on terrorist financing, Viri Chauhan, MD of Themis Community, talks to Nic Ryder, Professor of Financial Crime at Bristol Business and Law School, about the basics of what is terrorist financing. They discuss the impact of how the money laundering regime and relevant UN conventions and EU directives related to money laundering have shaped the policy on terrorist financing. Current threats are discussed that range from cyber and crypto methods of moving money for terrorist aims to the impact COVID-19 may have had on terrorist funding.
Welcome to this podcast, Themis podcast on terrorist financing. I'm Viri Chauhan and I'm the MD for Themis Community. Today, this podcast is brought to you with Professor Nic Ryder from the University of West of England. Nic is an expert and leader in the subject of terrorist financing. He's written many books and publications on the subject and has worked widely in the field in the private sector and in government agencies. This is going to be the first of two podcasts. This one's going to deal mainly with the basics of terrorist financing. First of all, let me introduce Nic. Hello, Nic.
Hi, Viri. How are you?
I'm very well, Nic. If we could start by just going into some explainers, could you tell us what you understand to be terrorist financing?
Yeah, of course. The classic and probably the most simplest definition of terrorism financing is reverse money laundering. So in your normal money laundering process, as your previous listeners will know, you place, layer and integrate the money into the financial system and try to hide and disguise your proceeds of crime. Terrorism financing is the opposite process. So in 99.9% of most terrorism financing instances or cases, the terrorists will use clean money and then they will taint that to promote a particular ideology or to promote an act of terrorism. So normally terrorists will be able to obtain clean money and then use it for laundering purposes. So what you will normally find is that a lot of the finances that terrorists will use could be, for example, from misapplied charitable donations. So whereby the person giving the money to what they perceive is a legitimate, lawful charity, unbeknown to them, it will then be used to fund acts of terrorism, which, according to previous research in the area, was a very popular method in terms of how Al-Qaeda were financed.
I see. Okay, so you use the term reverse money laundering and clean money. So does that mean that it's more difficult to try to identify the sources of terrorist financing?
Yes, and one of the major reasons for that is that the international anti-money laundering model, heavily influenced by the 3 UN conventions and 6 MLDs with the European Union, and of course the FATF amended recommendations, they're all geared towards tackling money laundering. And in a 2018 paper, we concluded that can be referred to as the profit reporting model, or the proceeds of crime reporting model. And after 9/11, the United Nations and the European Union and FATF, I think mistakenly, used the profit reporting model to tackle terrorism financing. And of course, the two are significantly different. So where money laundering will involve the proceeds of crime, and as we've seen through various organized crime syndicates and through how terrorists can be financed, you're not talking small sums of money here. But terrorists will not necessarily transfer larger sums of cash. They will try to avert transposing any money within the reporting sector. So they will, thus, as you said, indicating in your question, making it very difficult to detect, because the terrorism typology, terrorism financing typologies will be significantly different from how money laundering will occur.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of international regulations. You mentioned the money laundering directives from the European Union, and you mentioned some of the United Nations conventions that address this. So are you suggesting that that legislation, which is primarily initially been money laundering focused, has been misapplied to deal with terrorist financing?
Yes, the terrorist attacks in America in September 2000 were a galvanizing factor for the international community, largely led by the US, to tackle terrorism financing. And scholars at the time, going back nearly 20 years ago, were very skeptical whether the money laundering model would be the most effective to tackle terrorism financing. And if you look back at the history of the UN provisions, and in particular the US provisions, they've been heavily influenced by the use of the term suspicious activity or suspicious transaction. And that is probably one of the central tenets or pillars of the US and global money laundering policies. So the initial reaction by the United Nations was just before 9/11, and that was the 1999 International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorism Financing. We'll just call it the convention for now. It'll save me repeating that on numerous occasions. So the 99 Convention was largely based on presidential executive orders signed by Bill Clinton after the Al-Qaeda attacks in Kenya and Tanzania. And the convention was only signed by between 4 to 6 countries before 9/11. Since 9/11, it's now been signed up by over 135 different countries. So it's become a very important international provision. But it's based upon looking for the proceeds of crime. And that's why I think the model is fundamentally flawed, sadly, and it needs to be carefully reconsidered by the various institutions I mentioned previously.
Okay, so in terms of historical events, it was 9/11 that really changed the nature of the legislation and the sort of standards going forward on terrorist financing.
Absolutely. I think from an international perspective, yes, the UK can be contrasted because the UK has a very long established history of tackling terrorism financing with the domestic terrorism in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So according to many studies, the laws date back to the 19th and 20th century. And the UK has had some success disrupting the finances of the IRA and other what we call sort of domestic terrorist groups. But 9/11, absolutely, it is a catalyst, and what we've ended up with since is if I can call it, it's a plethora of sort of initiatives, international, regional, and domestic laws, which form part of what George Bush famously referred to in the Rose Garden strategy in September 2001 as the war on terrorism, or the global war on terrorism. What we found is that nobody really defines what are the financial aspects of the global war on terrorism. So over a 4-year period, I was involved in writing a research book, as it was, that defined the financial war on terrorism. And I still think it's the only book that's done that in the particular area. So it looked at the UN provisions, EU provisions, FATF recommendations, and other best practices to try to figure out what that term actually meant. So at least now we have a working definition of what makes up the financial war on terrorism. But as we said, it is heavily influenced on the international money laundering provisions.
Sure. So then, if we then turn to the current terrorist financing regime for our members, what should we be aware of at the moment in terms of basics?
I think in terms of the basic legal obligations for your members and colleagues to comply with, obviously we have the 2000 Terrorism Act and the use of Defence Against Terrorism Financing Suspicious Activity Reports, the mouthful for you. But also it's very important to be familiar with the provisions of Part 7 of the 2002 Proceeds of Crime Act. So it is about implementing a robust KYC regime, customer due diligence, and making sure that your colleagues, customers, companies that you work with are up to date on, I suppose, the current terrorism financing trends. And that's an evolving, highly sophisticated, yet in some cases quite a simple way in which they're financed. And it's about making sure that they are aware of the perceived threats and the emerging funding mechanisms which have been used by terrorists.
Okay, so there's sort of you mentioned a couple of the key legislations in the UK that will require members and our companies to comply with specific requirements, which are obviously driven by either the Financial Action Task Force and regional legislation. So presumably other countries would follow similar provisions from international conventions, etc. Is that right?
Yeah, they would do, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that the Financial Action Task Force are the best international practice, the sort of the gold standard or barometer in terms of the recommendations, and they will undertake a mutual evaluation report of how different countries will comply with its recommendations and, of course, the implementation of the international counter-terrorism financing strategies. The UK, under a new methodology, received the highest rating in December 2018 in their fourth mutual evaluation report. So other countries like Australia, America, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain will implement or attempt to implement a very robust counter-terrorism financing regime based upon the FATF recommendations, but also the core principles of the UN Security Council resolutions that were implemented just after the attacks in America in September 2001.
Okay, that's fine. So I understand that. So in terms of the current regime, you've explained that really well for us. In terms of the main threats at the moment, what do you see that to be?
That's a good question. We've published a new paper which is out later this year or early next year in the Journal of Business Law, and the paper looked at the sort of emerging trends of terrorism financing, but it investigated the perceived threat from terrorism financing via crypto assets. Obviously, that term can be given a broad interpretation. It could be cryptocurrencies, also virtual currencies, but I'm using the terminology used by the Financial Conduct Authority. There's crypto assets and the use of social media platforms. Within that paper, we were able to identify several cases, primarily from America, where we were able to find successful convictions brought by the Department of Justice, where people have been attempting to advise, in particular, ISIS of how to mine Bitcoin and then communicating via social media platforms. And I think in March this year, one of the cases, a lady called Zubia Hussain, who committed bank fraud, about $28,000, attempted to transfer some of that to ISIS via Bitcoin. And she was convicted and is now serving 13 years imprisonment. So that's just one of the cases. And in another rather sad case, a 17-year-old student was given 11 years imprisonment for advising ISIS on Twitter how to mine Bitcoin through his Twitter handle. So it's beginning to become more and more evident from our research and the findings that there was a particular weakness in the, I suppose, how the counter-terrorism financing regime applied to crypto assets in particular. And you look at the history of crypto assets in the dark web, Silk Road, Western Union, very well documented cases of illegal activity on the dark web. But what we were also able to find is that, and this is what we looked in particular at the reporting obligations in the UK, is do they apply to payments made via social media platforms? And from our understanding, they do apply. But that then raises the question, who reports? So if you, for example, made a Facebook Messenger payment from person A to person B of £30, and it's deemed to be suspicious by Facebook, does Facebook report it? Do Santander report it, or Barclays? So you've got a real uncertainty there. So we identified a number of weaknesses within the UK's regime and made some, hopefully, some important recommendations, which I'd be happy to discuss either now or later on in terms of questions. So the crypto assets were a significant threat. And in a new paper, which is out later next year, we think we've identified a new terrorism financing fraud typology. And what we've been able to do is to build on existing work by the Financial Action Task Force, the IMF, and other pieces of work by scholars to actually make the typology more substantive based upon case law and judicial precedent. So that shows terrorism financiers have a fraud dossier, like a black book, if you like, of what frauds they can commit, low-level frauds, which will avoid detection by law enforcement agencies. So you have the advances of technology, and then back to basics with fraud, which is how the IRA were financed for decades.
Yes. Okay. So it looks like technology is another enabling factor here. And at the start, you mentioned that actually clean money can be used, i.e., legitimate money can be used for terrorist financing purposes, but also that example that you've just provided there, that's criminal proceeds being used for financing terrorism. So both apply here. So if I can move on to some more sort of current sort of affairs globally, and I'm not sure if this has had an impact, but events like COVID-19 and similar types of events, do they actually feature in the terrorist financiers toolbook to take advantage of?
That's a good question. It's quite difficult to say without any substantive evidence. I mean, what we have seen, of course, with COVID is a significant increase of fraudulent activity. With regards to, I'm sure we've all had the random texts from the British government regarding payments and continue to receive emails linked into COVID. Terrorism financing is a little bit difficult to specifically say, but what we might find is that, and this has been reported in the news recently, what we might find, of course, with the height of the lockdown is that people are going to become more lonely and might be more susceptible to radicalization. But I can't say categorically that has happened, and hopefully we won't see any cases. But if anything, what COVID would probably do is it will illustrate the importance of increased scrutiny and awareness of how people interact on social media, how people interact on Skype, Zoom, and other forms of communication, and sort of encrypted messaging like WhatsApp and Telegram. So it's possible that people will be advised by terrorism financiers on how they are able to acquire funding, whether that be through debit card fraud, as we've seen with the Salman Abedi case, or whether that's through personal loan fraud, because they can be very susceptible to terrorists acquiring financing via basic white-collar crime.
Okay, so it's clear from what you've said that there's been a marked increase in fraud and financial crime due to COVID that could be taken advantage of by people who want to use financing for terrorist purposes. I understand that. Okay, Nick. Well, we're going to come to a close to this first podcast, but before we do, could you sort of give us, I suppose, some tips in terms of, for our members, if they want to become more familiar with terrorist financing and how to manage it? What sources or what tips would you provide?
I think in terms of sources, I would obviously highly recommend being familiar with the Financial Action Task Force's recommendations and typologies. I think that's an excellent place to start. I think secondly, it's important to engage with the UK's national risk assessments from 2015 and 2017 and the economic crime plan. And thirdly, I would strongly recommend that your listeners engage with academic research. There are a few of us that write on counter-terrorism financing, not many of us as compared to money laundering, but there are some excellent bodies of work. There's Dr. Colin King, Professor Clive Walker. I've written a few publications on terrorism financing, and there are others. So I think it's important to look at the university repositories and to find out what we've written and what our views are. Some of them involve empirical fieldwork, which leads to some very interesting sets of conclusions and recommendations as well.
Well, that's really good advice. Thank you so much for joining us on this first podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you give us an explainer on terrorist financing, and look forward to the second one. Thank you.
Thanks, Viri.
Thank you for listening to the latest Themis podcast. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you would like to find out more about Themis, get in touch with us via our website, www.crime.financial. You can also subscribe for future news and interviews.